Welcome to another STARS webinar. I am David Earn, Director of Programs and Communication at STARS. For those of you who are here for the first time, STARS webinars are interactive discussions about future-oriented topics such as leadership, geopolitics, technology, climate change, and health. We have over 700 people attending today's webinar live and asking their own questions, and hundreds more watch STARS webinars later on as a recording. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you. Today we discuss with Dr. Peter MAURER what it takes to meet humanitarian needs in complex and protracted crises. Peter has been president of the ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross, since 2012. Established in 1863, the ICRC is one of the most widely recognized organizations in the world, having won 3 Nobel Peace Prizes. Under Peter's leadership, the ICRC employs over 20,000 people and carries out humanitarian work in over 80 countries, helping people affected by conflict and armed violence and promoting the laws that protect victims of war. Peter was previously Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs in Bern, as well as Ambassador and Head of Switzerland's Permanent Mission to the United Nations in New York. Good morning to you, Peter, and thank you for speaking in today's webinar.
Morning. Great to see you, David.
We now have 30 minutes to discuss with Peter. I will take the privilege to ask the first couple questions. In the meantime, if you have any questions for Peter, please use the Q&A feature below to type in your question. Without any further ado, let's get right into it. And let me start by recalling this shocking figure that in 2021, 1 in 33 people worldwide will need humanitarian assistance. Amid ongoing violent conflict, rising hunger, and the effects of climate change and the pandemic, of course, this number only keeps growing. So to kick off this webinar, I would therefore like to pick the brains of all 700 participants around the globe with a quick anonymous poll. All participants should now see the poll on their screen. The question is, in the next 5 years, what do you see as the single biggest factor causing or aggravating humanitarian crises? You can only choose one factor, so please choose the one that you expect to have the biggest impact in the next 5 years. Okay, let's close the poll and have a look at the results. Everyone should now see the results on the screen. First up, 42% said that climate change is the single biggest factor causing or aggravating humanitarian crises in the next 5 years. And a close second, conflict and violence. Peter, if you look at these expectations about the next 5 years, does this also reflect how the ICRC sees the future?
Well, it's very close to our analysis. Let me just remind you that the last 10 years, conflict and violence has predominantly been the driver of humanitarian needs and has informed the humanitarian sector. But I would recognize that increasingly, in the context in which we operate, climate change becomes an aggravating factor. Slightly higher than in the poll, I would value the impact of global recession, in particular combined with the pandemic that we have seen over the last year. Maybe what I wanted to highlight even more than the 5 factors that you have now polled is the combination of those 5 elements, which is the single most important driver of humanitarian needs and humanitarian crises. It's the combination of violence and climate change and pandemics and recession and disease. And I think there is an interaction which doesn't allow us in many places just to separate neatly those 5 factors, but there is interaction. And so there is perfect storms and hyperfragility is building when these factors interact with each other. So the 1 in 33 is that you have mentioned in your introduction, David, is very much also a consequence of out of control dynamic between the 5 elements that you have pulled.
In addition to the increasing complexity of humanitarian crises, the humanitarian sector itself also has its own challenges. What do you consider to be the 3 key challenges that the humanitarian sector has to overcome to respond effectively in the future?
Well, if you give me 3 and not 30 or 300, I would probably choose first the maintenance and negotiation of a neutral and impartial humanitarian space, which is non-politicized and which in this space we can assist and protect people. And I would, within that first challenge, mention that we need not only to find a space, but also the exit of a space. I think one of the big issues today is how to define not only an emergency response to people in need, but when do we get out of humanitarian logic into pathways towards more independent lives, which goes beyond humanitarianism. A second, of course, going back to the poll and the dynamic between the 5 factors is, of course, that we see places with hyperfragility and enormous needs. And it is, in my view, impossible to believe that we can finance humanitarian work in the future just by the traditional economic model of fundraising to spend on humanitarian issues. So the whole financial issues, what are the financial products, the financial logic is a big challenge for the future. And I think the discrepancy between needs and financial possibilities according to the traditional model is a critical challenge. And a third issue I would like to mention is really the digital transformation, because I think, as in any other profession, digital transformation is also affecting the humanitarian sector. Needs as well as tools to analyze and to deliver humanitarian sector increasingly are digitalized, use digital tools. And I think that's an enormous transformation from just organizational logic to network and digital space logic, which increasingly penetrates the humanitarian sector and has to be managed by the organizations which are key stakeholders of the humanitarian sector.
You already hinted at it. One of the priorities for your presidency is to improve the humanitarian response through innovation and new partnerships. Can you give us a few specific examples of ICRC's innovations that you are most excited about?
Well, there is, of course, technical innovation in the sense that what we have done in the past, we can do better by innovation. We have developed better wheelchairs, giving more agility to people. We have developed better prostheses for handicapped people, which allow them to move faster and better and integrate better into society. We have looked at series of technical innovations, for instance, thermal sensing for mine action, for identifying mines and having a clearer vision and where mines are hidden in the ground. We have developed a series also of analytical tool doing data drilling and having a better idea on where needs are and what kinds of needs are driving specific context. And then we have financial innovation going, again, to go back what I said before, from a traditional fundraising model to a model of investing in human capital and investing in increasing independence of people. We have created humanitarian impact bond. We have blended financing. We have created blended finance instruments. We are looking at impact philanthropy and impact investment models for the humanitarian sector. So there is analytical, there is sort of technical, there is financial and financial innovation going on. I think there is a huge panoply. I have in front of me a list of roughly 50 projects which are ongoing at the present moment and which promise new forms of humanitarian assistance. Let me just end and say, also in the digital space itself, we are developing really digital tools to identify misinformation, which is a key driver of violence. Let's remind us that the Rwandan genocide more than 20 years ago has been driven by misinformation of radio and of the radio Mille Collines. Today, misinformation is coming to the cyberspace. We have to identify it early to appeal to responsibility of digital providers.
Let's take questions from the audience. The first question comes from Dr. Bruno Gehrig, board member of Merki Baumann and former chairman of Swiss and Swiss Life, a former board member of Roche, UBS, and the Swiss National Bank. He writes, you represent an organization that strongly suffers from financial problems, which means that you have to save. How do you set your priorities and how do you decide in which context to act or not to act?
Well, first, there is a business logic, as in any business, which makes us save money. I think technological innovation is introduced at the ICRC in order to do things with less resources and more impactful. And a lot of the innovations that I have mentioned are at the same time saving exercises and efficiency exercises. So I wanted to highlight that we do that. We do simple cost cutting in the organization. Last year, I have ordered a 10% headquarter cut because of the financial difficulties. And then your question is more how we set priorities in the field. And there, I think there is a two-tier approach. One thing is very much needs assessment. I think the credibility of neutrality is that we direct humanitarian assistance where we find objectively the biggest needs. And so that defines priority. Now, to be very honest, Mr. Gehrig, there is also the problem that where the biggest needs are, we do not always have access. And therefore, the tension between objective needs and our capacity to negotiate access with state and non-state actors is a big challenge. And then you have a third pillar where you constantly, each and every day, have to balance. And this is, of course, finances. But finances is not the only sort of limiting factor that we are encountering. But what we do each and every day to set priorities is to find the optimal solution between available finance, access negotiations, and needs assessment. And to find this balance between the three pillars is a daily management and oversight challenge at ICRC. And I think what I would like to highlight is that we are able and astonishingly able to continuously negotiate these spaces and to be in many places where others are not. And the basis of this is trust with belligerence, is neutrality, is a long-standing credibility of the organization.
Next question comes from Dr. Daniel Wocker, former Swiss ambassador and co-founder of Sharon Ambassador. He's asking you to comment on the relationship between the ICRC and the specialized UN organizations. Where's there room to improve the collaboration?
Well, we do a lot of good work together. We have long passed beyond the sort of ideological water-shedding moments where the ones are here and the others are there. I think in the field, there is a lot of good collaboration, in particular with the very operational UN agencies, HCR, High Commission on Refugees, UNICEF, as well as World Food Programme and ICRC are most of the time four key pillars of a humanitarian service and delivery programs. We work together very closely in most of the 15, 20 critical context. My next meeting is with Filippo Grandi, where we have almost bi-monthly meetings to look at our operations to see how we can improve cooperation. So I think there is a lot going on. There is, of course, also a recognition that we are not representing always the same facets of humanitarian work. And therefore, in some areas, ICRC has better access and the UN agencies normally have more volume. And I think the two together are good complementarity. So what we do normally with the specialized UN agencies is really that we are in a network of, I would say, 6 or 7 agencies, which, by the way, includes Doctors Without Borders, the Red Cross movement, and 5 UN agencies, which are the most operational, where we really try to build on cooperation, but also on complementarity.
We have 2 follow-up questions from the audience about digital innovation, particularly blockchain. What do you think about the use of blockchain technology within the context of humanitarian aid? And are you already using this technology?
We have done exploration on blockchain, but it is not yet a mainstream tool. I think one of the dilemmas around blockchain at the end of the day is the transparency versus secrecy confidentiality aspect. One of the credibility of the Red Cross movement, of the pillars of credibility, is in transparency. Blockchain allows you best possible security of transaction, but best possible security of transaction is not necessarily offering you best possible transparency. And so I think we will certainly continue to explore to see how we can use blockchain, to see how we can use secure transaction. But I do believe that there is more negotiation necessary also towards our donors to see when and how we can use blockchain in humanitarian assistance. It's similar with drones. Drones give you insights, and at the same time, they don't generate the trust and confidence which is necessary, because they come with the suspicion of spying over the adversary. So there are limits to the use of technology, be it in blockchain, be it in drones and other tools. But I think we are exploring these new innovations in order to see what exactly the space is that we can use.
The next question comes from Walter Mulondi. He's a radio producer in Beni, in the DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, and he's asking about the role of media, keeping in mind the negative impact that fake news bring for field assessments and operations. How can media be effective? How can media be a key asset in humanitarian actions?
Well, I think it is important that you have a strategy of truthful communication to bring your message out into the media, into the social media. And I think the whole humanitarian sector has increasingly used the media as transporter of factuality. And I think that's important. As I alluded in my introduction, in the digital innovation space, I think we do have really to tackle together with the key providers of social networks. We have to launch the discussion for the humanitarian sector as it is launched for any other sector on what the responsibility of the big tech firms are in transporting wrong misinformation, disinformation into the public space. And I think the Australian case over the last couple of days has been a classical one. I think the last word is not spoken, and the humanitarian sector is not different from what will be going on in the society at large with regard to publisher responsibility, be it in traditional media or new media. But I do agree with you that misinformation through new technologies and new possibilities of media is a big challenge.
We have a question from Australia, from Echiden Nichimbere. He's a fellow at the Diplo Foundation in Canberra. He's asking you to talk about innovation, whether you can give an example of engaging non-state actors in conflict, especially in the era of climate change.
Well, innovation in regard to non-state actors, I would rather just in the innovative part highlight that one of the largest programs that ICRC has launched over the last couple of years is really to understand the behavioral science aspect and dimension of non-state armed groups. And we have invested a lot in academic and practical research on understanding what makes non-state armed groups tick. And I think this has allowed us to have much more in-depth knowledge and recognition on how to influence non-state armed groups and to nudge them into behavior according to international humanitarian law. That's one of the key issues of our work. And we have seen through innovative research supported by behavioral science that the structure of non-state armed group influences their behaviors and gives us indication on how we engage, train, and create humanitarian spaces and respect for basic behavior. A second issue when you look at climate change is, of course, to understand the dynamics which are ongoing at the present moment between violence and climate change, and which are at the origin of a lot of drivers which create non-state armed groups. I'm just back from sub-Saharan Africa, and in the Sahel and sub-Saharan Africa, you see that climate change is an important driver at the origin of creating non-state armed groups, because people are exposed to climate change. Herders and agriculturalists see their lives disrupted. This leads to the creation of new forms of societal organization, including non-state armed groups. They arm themselves, they get violent. And so there is a link here which we need to understand in order to be able to influence.
We have a comment and a question from Barbara Hintermann. She's the Director General of Terre des Hommes in Lausanne. She's writing, you mentioned maintaining and negotiating humanitarian space. As we all know, some regions are not accessible anymore for expatriates, and we do send our national staff instead. But local staff become more and more the target of some armed groups. Hence, what is your reflection on this, in particular when we talk about our duty of care?
Well, it is a reality that we have blank spots in the world which are increasingly difficult to negotiate. I think we need, nevertheless, to be able, with international or non-international staff, to make an extra effort to have access into those regions. I think as an organization, it has become obviously unacceptable that we just shift risk towards our national staff, and we keep our international staff safe at headquarters. I think it's, in terms of duty of care, an unacceptable trend. and our effort will remain to give the necessary surroundings, education, training, support for whoever negotiates at front lines, which is, as we know, a dangerous issue. But I think the bifurcation of staff into national staff taking higher risks than international is not an acceptable basis of an HR policy today. And but what allows us to mitigate is better training, is better tools, is better support for whoever, whether nationals or internationals, are at front lines.
The next question comes from Urs Brutsch. He's the owner of UB Services. He's writing, trust is an important prerequisite for being active in a country. When is the right moment to leave a country? What conditions must be created in order not to damage the trust of the population in ICRC in the long term?
Well, as you know, as in any aspects of life, trust comes from walking the talk and from saying what you do and doing what you say. There is no good moment to leave a country in a humanitarian perspective, and this makes humanitarians, at the end of the day, is a weak link in the whole idea of humanitarianism. Every belligerent knows that at the end of the day, humanitarians are there to save lives, and they stay longest and as long as ever possible to save lives. So there is not a good moment to leave a country. Our approach as an organization is that when our presence is taking an unacceptably high toll on us and the security of our personnel, or if our presence is even damaging or misused and manipulated in a way which is damaging to the assistance and protection to people, you have to leave. ICRC, for instance, has in the past at certain moments have given up prison visits because we have seen that when visiting prisoners, instead of protecting those visited, they have been exposed to more violence and abuse. So that's the moment where you have to leave. So the do no harm principle, as humanitarians call it, and the security of staff are two of the most important factors you want to watch over on a continuous basis to know when critical moments are there. Besides that, I think we need to do the extra mile. Our efforts have to focus on access and not on how to leave.
Next question comes from STARS alumnus and your ICRC colleague, Pablo Percelsi. He is the head of delegation of the ICRC in Bangladesh. He's writing, after 8 years at the helm of the ICRC, how do you perceive the importance of big corporations in tech, pharma, energy in the debate around humanitarian space? Are they playing a different, more prominent role in formal discussions?
I think one of the big mistakes that we make in these discussions is to suppose that big tech firms are just one and have one behavior. I think what is critical for an organization like ours is to see whether we can define and negotiate partnership which are in the interest of both and on which we can learn and mutually reinforce our work, and whether this partnership with big firms, be them pharmaceuticals, tech, or whatever companies, is delivering positive impact. If we partner, for instance, with Novo Nordisk on non-communicable diseases, this partnership needs to translate into impact for people, and it does. And so I think the key issue is really having and defining partnership for impact. And I think we are certainly having some excellent partnership with impact, but it needs specificity, and we need to go beyond the debate on whether big firms are good or bad, and whether partnering with them is good or bad. It depends on the result you achieve.
We have a follow-up question on the humanitarian impact bond you mentioned previously. The question comes from Doris Albis, so she's the executive chairman of Evalu Globe. What is your experience so far with the humanitarian impact bond launched a few years ago?
Well, I think it's a pilot. It has the characteristics of a pilot. It has driven innovation on the ground in the management of centers, and it has increased the efficiency and effectiveness of physical rehabilitation centers at ICRC. The bond as such is going on well in terms of the funds we raised and the centers we create. So we seem to be able to navigate after a 5 years period to a successful conclusion and repayment schemes. But I think one of the lessons learned in those partnerships is that if we want to create a market for fragile contexts and humanitarian contexts, we need more than just bilateral partnerships between humanitarian agencies and the private sector or private investors. We need, and this is the big issue of today's debate, we need more systematic de-risking, and de-risking comes from state and others coming on board to de-risk those innovative financial schemes. So maybe one of the lessons learned is that on the one side, the technicalities of the bond and of other financial tools are, I think, useful and have proven their usefulness. But the overall schemes of building a financial market around fragility and resilience building is still a long way to go. Unsurprisingly, how many years have we taken to make a carbon offset market functioning? I mean, it doesn't happen from one day to another.
We have a question on partnerships and innovation again. The question comes from Diana Segantini. She's the head of arts and culture at Amala in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. She's asking you to give an example of a new and efficient type of cooperation the ICRC has with probably surprising partners, not necessarily institutional partners.
Well, the question is a little bit what surprising is. As I mentioned, we have long lists, but of business and other partners. But I would, by and large, say the bulk of the positive partnership comes from innovative firms and comes from bringing people together to co-create. If I look at the list of what we have done and where it has impact, it's because somehow there is a relationship building up and you manage to bring people into a room and around a table. When I go back, for instance, to the thermal sensing, I have given an address at Waseda University in Tokyo. The chairman of NEC, Nippon Electronic, was listening to the conference. He came towards me, we sat together, and after a year, the result is a major science, university-based, high-tech project which produces in tests very satisfactory results of thermal sensing of mines, and which we hopefully can deploy in this year and next year as a useful, innovative tool. So my point here is, as in research and science, sometimes innovation and impact are not really, cannot be planned from the beginning. There is a dynamic going on, but what makes positive dynamics? Positive dynamics come from people of different horizons coming together and create values. And I think that's what I'm increasingly interested in. The whole debate in the humanitarian sector is about coordination and cooperation, but that's not an interesting debate. At the end of the day, the interesting debate is how to create value chains. We want to produce impact for people. Who is able to give to make an impact and to build those value chains from science, from research to science to cooperations, and then impact and testing on the ground. This is what drives innovation, and it can have very surprising partners coming up.
If we stay on the topic of innovation, let me take the next question from Nan Buzar. Is the head of innovation at the ICRC. You have been a strong proponent and leader of humanitarian diplomacy. What do you think of this effort in the next 10 years?
Well, I continue to believe that, as I mentioned, one of the big challenges is to define a humanitarian space and to define the rules governing a humanitarian space. This has been the core of humanitarianism since it was founded. Modern humanitarianism was founded in the 19th century. So I suppose that the challenge of creating this humanitarian space will remain in the future, and humanitarian diplomacy is one key and important tool to negotiate and create that humanitarian space. It has principles, it has skills, it has knowledge. It needs to adapt to partners and to see who are influencers in the humanitarian space. And I don't see any difference in the next 10 years on the challenge. I can see that humanitarian diplomacy will go virtual, will have different ways of influencing how to negotiate humanitarian space, how to move within those spaces. And I think that's the whole transformational aspect that I was talking about. I think, as in diplomacy overall, diplomacy traditional will certainly have a certain role and continue to have a certain role, but diplomacy 2.0 will be more digital. We'll have other participants around the table. We'll have new participants informing this humanitarian space, state, non-state, private military and security companies, criminal actors increasingly defining how the humanitarian space is, and diplomacy will have to manage this multiplicity of actors and challenges. And finally, let me just again highlight what I mentioned at the very beginning. One of the critical challenges for humanitarian diplomacy is also to define the exit. One is to negotiate the space, and the other is to clearly define the exit, because one of the critical issues for the future will, at the end of the day, be how we cut through the dynamic of constantly and protracted and long-term crises where people remain in dependency. And therefore, diplomacy must create humanitarianism which defines pathways to independent lives. And so creating the condition for the humanitarian space, but also negotiating the way out of the humanitarian space, and create conditions under which humanitarians can work on this pathway is absolutely essential for humanitarian diplomacy.
We have already gone well into overtime, but I'd like to return to the topic of business and the role of business to wrap up the webinar by taking a final question from the audience. The question comes from Christina Bache. She's a visiting fellow at the London School of Economics and Political Science. She's writing, can you kindly comment on the role that business has to play in addressing conflict drivers and how they might contribute to more resilient, just and equitable markets and communities by adopting positive business principles?
Well, as you rightly say, Krishna, I think first, let me say, business is not business. Each and every company defines what kind of profile it takes in society. On a normative aspects, we are interested in companies who take a proactive role and think about the impact of business on society and try to enhance positive and to minimize negative impact. I think relationship between us and the business sector should help us each one sensitize on what the areas of cooperation are. I'm deeply convinced that the sort of corporate responsibility, ESG, and other aspects are residual roles within the framework of responsibility of business. As you rightly say, responsible business practice integrates into business practice the impact on society, and it can bring to a lot of problems that are humanitarian problems, innovative and new solutions. What humanitarians can offer to those who want to proactively shape society and the environment is knowledge on communities and problems and challenges on the ground. We can show the way, but we don't have the solution. Business practices and the willingness of business to responsibly shape their environment in a business logic can really bring innovative solution, and that's the type of partnerships we are envisaging.
Despite all the difficulties and all the unpredictabilities that we discussed over the last 40 plus minutes, what gives you hope as a humanitarian that the future will be any better than the past?
My biggest hope is the resilience and innovative capacities of communities affected by violence, armed conflict, humanitarian disasters overall. I'm always surprised how resilient societies are in which we operate, and one of the biggest discrepancies is between a certain perception, in particular in developed society, on what a humanitarian crisis is and what people in a humanitarian crisis do. There is always this kind of prejudice that people in a humanitarian crisis are just waiting for help. And I can firmly contradict. I have never seen a society and a community who is waiting for help. Most community help themselves first. And I think the resilience and innovative capacities of communities to deal with difficult situations and also to find themselves way out of the crisis is of critical importance. What we can do as outsiders is then support this resilience. And I think what gives me hope is the resilience. What we need to do is finding better ways as humanitarians, as development actors, as private sector, to support the basic force and capacity and innovative drive of communities and societies affected by crises to find ways out of the crisis, and I think not to patronize, not to over-influence, not to kill the resilience of community is of critical importance, and that needs thoughtful interventions in terms of positively supporting the resilience of individuals and communities. And this gives me hope because there are great success stories all over.
With that wonderful closing statement, I would like to thank you very much, Peter, for making the time and for sharing your perspective with us. Thank you, Peter.
Thanks a lot.
I would also like to thank everyone who participated in today's webinar. Thank you for your interest, and I hope to see you in the next STARS webinar. In the meantime, take care and stay healthy. Thank you and goodbye.